Did you know that the Flash movie took over 20 years to make? It's kind of ironic that a movie about the fastest man alive had such a slow development, but it's true. There's been reports about Warner Brothers trying to make a Flash movie all the way back during the 1980s through the early 2000s, well before the DCU even started, and once Warner actually began work on their DC cinematic universe and they casted Ezra Miller as their Flash, they still took almost 10 years to finally make a movie about the character. And they went through many different writers and directors such as Rick Famuyiwa, comic book writer Grant Morrison, and even the main creatives behind the Lego movie and the Spider-Verse movies. Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were attached to direct The Flash at one point, which I was really excited for when it was announced, and really disappointed when they finally left the project. So it's kinda crazy to me that after decades of failed Flash movie attempts, the film that we finally got just doesn't really feel like a Flash movie. Because it's not. It's actually a Flashpoint movie. For anyone who's already familiar with the story, this will seem a little obvious, but for anyone who's unfamiliar with the story that The Flash is based on, Flashpoint was a company-wide DC Comics event story which served to reboot the entire DC universe back in 2011, and it allowed the company to relaunch all of their comic titles under the New 52 branding, which meant to start a new era of DC Comics. While the original Flashpoint storyline did have Barry Allen as its main protagonist, he wasn't the only and main focus of the story. The OG story also started with Barry going back in time in order to save his mom, but that's only the inciting incident that allowed the story to take place. The real main focus of Flashpoint is to try to reset the DC universe and try to repair the damages that were done to the timeline. That's why Flashpoint is first and foremost a story about the DCU at large before being a personal story about the Flash. Because while Barry and his inability to move on from his mother's death is the emotional core of the story, the actual plot itself is much more preoccupied with being an event for the entire DC universe. And given that it's an event, the story has many more elements from the general DC mythos, and it really doesn't have that many prominent elements that originate from the Flash's own comics and mythos. And much like the original comics Flashpoint, the Flash movie, since it's an adaptation of Flashpoint, also doesn't really have that many elements from the Flash mythos, and it mainly takes references and iconography from the Batman and Superman mythos instead. This is also why when Flashpoint was first adapted into an animated movie years back, they didn't market the movie as solely a Flash movie. They straight up called it Justice League: The Flashpoint Paradox, because they were able to recognize and admit that Flashpoint isn't fully a Flash story. And look, I'm not saying that the live-action movie should have been called Flashpoint instead of just The Flash. That'd have been silly. From a marketing standpoint, it's much smarter to keep things simple and just call it The Flash. But it doesn't change the fact that the movie adapted a DCU-wide story event as the first storyline of the very first solo Flash movie. And I'm also not saying that this is a bad movie, just to clarify. I like The Flash. I thought it was a pretty good movie overall, but I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that even though it has Barry Allen as its main character, The Flash just isn't a Flash movie. And I really do feel it's important to recognize this, because since the movie didn't really perform well at the box office, it might be a really long time until we get to see another solo Flash movie. And it's just crazy to me that after all these years, we finally got in a movie with the Flash as its protagonist, but it just doesn't feel like a Flash movie. To put things into perspective, the villain that had the most screen time in the very first Flash movie ever made was General Zod. And that's just weird to me. Imagine if after decades, Marvel finally made the first Black Panther movie, but instead of it being set in Wakanda and having Killmonger and Ulysses Klaue as its villains, it would have been set in Baltimore with Black Panther fighting the Mandarin. And look, I like the Mandarin just fine, but it'd be silly to have him as the villain of a Black Panther movie. And I feel the same with General Zod. I like him as a villain, and I love Michael Shannon's performance as him, but to have him as one of the villains in a Flash movie just doesn't feel right. The Flash has some of the most unique villains in all of comics. The Rogues are a group of empathetic villains with a set of morals and a code that they follow, like not killing or hurting women and children and trying to avoid killing as much as possible, using it only as a last resort. They all have interesting and distinct personalities and abilities, and they all have distinct relationships with the Flash. Captain Cold respects the Flash as an adversary, yet Heatwave, for example, is much more aggressive and would rather try to hurt the Flash as much as possible. These distinct personalities clash with one another, and the Flash and the Rogues have interesting relationships not only with the Flash, but with themselves as well. They aren't your typical megamaniacal comic book villains. They are a group of superpowered thieves with morals, a type of villain that we've never really seen in live action and in recent comic book movies. That's why it saddens me that they chose to pretty much ignore these unique elements from the Flash mythos, because this movie could have served to offer something completely fresh and different when compared to the rest of comic book movies. Like, for example, you know that common trope in most superhero movies where the main villain has the same powers as the hero? Well, here you have a hero that has potentially the greatest Dark Reflection type villain ever created, and of course, I'm talking about the Reverse Flash. Whether it be Eobard Thawne's fascinating and twisted backstory from the distant future, or Hunter Solomon's tragic fall from grace, all of the Reverse Flashes are great characters and one of the greatest takes on a dark version of a superhero, since they have a very interesting love-hate relationship with the Flash, where they recognize that they both need each other, since paradoxically, the Reverse Flash never would have existed without the Flash in the first place. A rivalry that is pretty much unique in the entire comic book medium. As most of you know, Eobard Thawne in particular was responsible for killing the Flash's mom. Thanks to the CW show and now this movie, it's probably one of the Flash's most recognizable aspects. And it might seem like it's always been a part of the Flash mythos ever since Barry Allen was created in the 1960s, but it's actually something that was retconned into the DC Universe fairly recently in 2009 during Flash Rebirth, a story which reintroduced Barry Allen into the DC Universe after he'd been dead for 25 years. So for most of the Flash's existence, this element wasn't a part of his mythos, and he only mentioned this because, while it is a cool aspect of his, it really shouldn't define him. The Flash has so much more story potential than just focusing on his tragic backstory and how that experience affected him. Reverse Flash himself has done a lot more than just kill Barry's mom, and some of those stories are amazing as well. Now, with all this villain talk, those of you who've seen the movie are probably wondering what I thought about the movie's surprise villain. And here's where I want to give a spoiler warning for those of you who haven't seen the movie yet. Up until now, I haven't really given away anything that wasn't revealed in the trailers, but now I'm going to talk more in detail about the movie. So if you haven't seen it, I recommend you do check it out and come back after you've watched it, because overall, I did like the movie, and I do very much recommend it. It has some flaws, but it's still a good movie in my opinion. In any case, the big reveal of this movie is that Barry Allen is actually the villain. Well, more specifically, his younger self from the Flashpoint timeline eventually transformed into the Dark Flash, after he spent hundreds of years traveling in time trying to save Batman, Supergirl, and his entire universe from dying. And honestly, I thought it was very well executed. While he had very little screen time as the Dark Flash himself, the movie still did a good job in convincing the audience that this younger Barry could eventually become unhinged. Even though he only recently got his powers, through the course of the movie, he shows to be very capable with them and learns new abilities really quickly. He's also only 18 years old, and it's understandable how if a young kid were to get godlike time warping powers, he would feel as if there's nothing he can't do and that he could literally save anyone. So it makes sense how he starts to lose his mind once our main Barry tries to explain to him that there are certain things that are out of their control and that can't be changed no matter how hard they try, like their mom's death for example, and how they need to let her go and allow her to die in order to save the universe at large. That was a really great theme that I thought was handled well. It's something that most people can relate to beyond the fantasy elements. As we grow up, we all eventually need to learn that there are certain things in life that we absolutely cannot control. This is a movie about overcoming trauma, letting go of the past, and not allowing ourselves to be defined by terrible things that may have happened to us. Barry Allen isn't only the main villain of the movie in a literal sense, because a version of him literally becomes a monster. He is also the main villain in a figurative sense, because he hasn't overcome the trauma of his mother dying when he was so young and growing up without both of his parents, which stunted his emotional development and eventually made him responsible for the timeline being altered and the dangerous consequences that brought. That's why, for all the movie's faults, I still think it's an overall good movie. It did a great job with Barry's character arc and his relationship with his mom. I know that a lot of people wanted to see Ezra Miller do a terrible job because of all the downright awful things he has done, and just to be clear, he's definitely a creep, but it's undeniable that he's a good actor. And beyond that, he was given good material to work with because Barry Allen was well written in the movie. Even though if I'm speaking as a comic book fan, I'm still underwhelmed by this version of Barry. But this is more of an issue of the DCEU at large, because ever since we first saw this version of the character in Batman v Superman, I knew that I wasn't going to see a faithful depiction of the Flash in the foreseeable future, because the DCEU Barry Allen just doesn't resemble comic book Barry Allen whatsoever. This version of him feels more like the hyperactive Bart Allen, if anything. This doesn't ruin my enjoyment of the movie or this version of Barry Allen, because he was still a well-written character. Little touches like having Barry clean up his apartment before Iris comes up, or the flashback we got to see of him saving a kid in Metropolis while Zod originally attacked the city in Man of Steel, are all beautiful details that give a lot of humanity to this version of Barry. So I'm not saying that just because the movie is different from the source material, it's automatically worse. I'm not saying that if this film had been about the Rogues or Professor Zoom, that the movie's quality would have immediately improved and it wouldn't have bombed at the box office. I'd be fine with this movie deviating and ignoring to adapt certain things from the comics if the alternative was better, but it's just not. Because while Barry Allen had good development throughout the movie, the rest of the film and its characters just kind of falls flat. The CGI, for example, is absolutely awful. I tend to focus on other things when I'm reviewing something, but the CG in this one was so bad that it's just impossible to ignore. It doesn't bring the whole film down, and the action scenes were still mostly well executed, but the CG being bad is just undeniable. But beyond that, none of the other characters beyond the two Barrys had any development. Our main character barely had a supporting cast in the movie. Patty Spivot and Albert Desmond were pretty much cameos for a couple scenes, and both Batmans and Supergirl barely had any screen time really, and were treated like plot devices more than actual characters. And this all makes sense once you realize that this movie just wasn't focusing on trying to be an actual Flash movie that fully adapts the elements of his world that complement the Flash and make him a more realized character, such as his supporting cast, classic villains, or his setting. That's why this movie, in my opinion, works great as a send-off to the DCEU at large. It's a great event movie, but as a Flash movie, it just falls short. There's an amazing episode of Justice League Unlimited focused on the Flash, which does a great job in showing all the fantastic elements that are unique to the Flash's world, such as his relatable relationship with the Rogues and how he approaches them with empathy and respect. And even beyond his great villains, it managed to adapt perfectly other great aspects from Flash comics, like the overall positive vibe and how the Flash interacts with everyone, from his allies to even his villains, in a charming and sincere way, and how the citizens from Central City love and support him back. It's a comic book city that loves their hero so much that he has an entire museum dedicated to him, and that's something really cool and unique to him. That episode really showed the potential of a Flash animated series, and just how great all Flash's stories can be, no matter the medium, from his distinctive world and relationships to his amazing rogues gallery. Because all of his villains really are that great. Guys like Captain Cold or Mirror Master would be amazing to see in live action, and those aren't all the examples of how great the Flash's rogues gallery is. A Gorilla Grodd live action movie would be insane. And it also showcases how outrageous and unashamedly over the top comic books can be. I'd literally yell in excitement if Gorilla Grodd would be announced as the villain of a Flash movie. It's just crazy to me that after all these years of waiting and fantasizing about a movie starring the Flash, they finally made one, and yet I still feel like I haven't seen a Flash movie at all. But oh well, let's hope we don't have to wait another 30 years before we get to see another attempt at a Flash movie. And hopefully, it's an actual Flash movie next time. But I talked about this movie long enough. I want to know from you guys now. What did you think about The Flash? Did you enjoy the movie? And what do you think they should do with the character moving forward? What villains and storylines would you like to see get adapted in a future Flash movie? Let me know in the comments below because I'm really interested. And as always, thank you so much for watching.